classroom. And so tonight's speaker is Dr. Kimberly Wortmann, and she is assistant professor in the Department of the Study of Religions at Wake Forest University. She's also a faculty member in the African Studies and Middle East and South Asia Studies programs at Wake Forest. Dr. Wortmann received her PhD in the study of religion in 2018 from Harvard University and has a master's in Islamic studies and African religions, also from Harvard, and a degree that she received in 2011, and then a BA in religious studies from, is it Macalester College? Is that right, Kimberly? Did I do it right? Okay, good. And 2007. As a scholar trained in Islamic and African studies, she's interested in the trans-regional networks of knowledge exchange, transmission, and production between East Africa and the Persian Gulf. On a personal note, I met Kimberly through an organization called Wabash, which offers a teaching workshop focused on undergraduate education, especially for early career scholars or for junior faculty members. And so for the last year, Kimberly and I have been in a cohort meeting monthly over Zoom and talking about ways that we can encourage one another in our teaching in the classroom, and also really just sort of learning, pushing ourselves, challenging ourselves to become better teachers, especially in the religious studies classroom. So I'm delighted to welcome her to Wingate, and I hope that all of you here are ready to learn a bit more about the sacred arts in Islam. And I'm going to encourage you to save your questions for Dr. Wortmann till the end, but you can use the chat and we will welcome a few questions at the end after the presentation. So thank you so much. We're so delighted to have you here at Wingate via Zoom.
Thank you so much, Professor Cobb. I'm sure your students know that, but if y'all don't, she's amazing. And I've been learning so much through the Wabash cohort about, teaching strategies and pedagogies from conversing with Dr. Cobb and, our other cohort members. So it's really kind of nice to also be able to enter sort of the Wingate classroom and share a little bit about what I know. Thank you to Kia and the other conveners of the Lyceum, and to your Department of Religious Studies at Wingate. So I'm going to share my screen to get started. Let's see here. Okay, go. So as you know, the title of here we go. Did everyone see that? Awesome. Okay. The title of this lecture or talk today is The Sacred Arts of African Muslims. And so when Dr. Cobb approached me about thinking of a topic, related to my research that, I could discuss that would also kind of give a good overview of Islamic traditions, I thought what better way to kind of do that than talking about it through the arts, because I like to use a lot of arts-based learning in my own classroom, in particular in introductory classes, but this also ties my own specific research interests in African societies and African Muslim societies specifically. So while I specialize in Eastern Africa, a lot of the examples are going to come from West Africa, but there's a lot of exchange of knowledge across the continent. Just want to say that from the beginning. So the learning outcomes for today, so many of you maybe have taken, some kind of course either in world religions or, basic course in Islamic studies. So some of this information might be helpful, but we'll just review some of the main concepts related to Islamic traditions, and in particular, the centrality of the Quran. So the Quran is sort of the Muslim holy book. It's called also a recitation. It's a holy scripture. And also the example of the Prophet Muhammad. So the Prophet Muhammad is often considered the founder of Islam and the first person to sort of spread the message of the Quran to humanity. So these are this is the main role model that we're going to be discussing. And then understand that Islam and the practice of Islam in Africa is diverse, and there are many schools of thought and interpretations of Islam, not only on the continent, but of course globally as well. And I think this really comes through in the artistic traditions. We'll learn about some of the ways that African Muslims have influenced and interpreted these traditions through their art, architecture, and material cultures. So I really want to emphasize, because we often think of or hear about Islam in the Middle East or on the Arabian Peninsula, but I want to kind of take this global perspective that is like more centered on the continent, but still global, and think about an exchange rather than Islam influencing or Arab societies or Middle Eastern societies influencing African societies. Think about it as an exchange of knowledge. So while some knowledge came from the Middle East to African communities, that was sort of adapted, appropriated, and interpreted in different ways locally. And then also gain familiarity with some of the material cultures and again architecture produced by African Muslims, in particular in Northern Africa, Western Africa, and the region that's called the Sahel. So it's this strip of land, mostly sand, that's south of the Sahara Desert and north of the savanna, so the more lush African savanna. That includes countries such as Mali and Senegal and Sudan. So these are going to be some of the main examples. So just in case we need a reminder, this is the African continent to the left, and then to the right is the Arabian Peninsula, which is sort of the birthplace of Islam. So if you can see that strip of water, the Red Sea to the right, that separates the African continent from the Arabian Peninsula. So it's amazing, they're very close to each other. So this exchange goes back a very long way to the earliest times of Islam. So Islam first came in the 7th century, and I'll talk about sort of the presence of Muslim communities in Africa, even at that time through these exchange networks. The two holiest cities of Islam, Mecca and Medina, are located in the region that borders the Red Sea in Saudi Arabia. So you can see them there, Mecca to the south and Medina to the north. So these are, really important for our discussion today as well. So the basics for Islamic traditions, who? So Muslims believe in Allah. So Allah is the one God. That's literally what that means. So it's a monotheistic tradition that is within the line of Abrahamic tradition. So it embraces the message of the Torah, embraces the message of the Gospels and the Psalms, but it sees the Quran as the final word of God and as the seal of all the words. So it's the last word that God sort of revealed to humanity. And this was through the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad. So the Prophet Muhammad was the first person to start preaching the message of the Quran and the recitations of the Quran. And so these two go hand in hand, this idea of a singular God and of the messengership of the Prophet. Muslims recognize the prophets of the Judeo-Christian traditions like Moses, Abraham, and Jesus, for example. But again, they believe that the Prophet Muhammad was the seal or the last of the prophets. So now, different, for example, from Christian traditions where Jesus has sort of a divine quality. For Muslims, Prophet Muhammad is categorically not divine, like he's Muslim. He's human. So that's a really major kind of point of distinction. So while there's a lot that's shared, there's this belief that the prophets were all strictly human. Okay. And again, so it's considered a monotheistic tradition, part of the Abrahamic traditions that uphold the Quran as the sacred text. And Muslims believe the Quran to be the literal word of God. So Mecca and Medina are the two holiest cities, as I said, and Mecca is the city where the Quran was first revealed to humans. The first revelation occurred in the 7th century in 610 CE, and I'll talk more about that in just a second. And Muslims believe that the Prophet Muhammad was taught the Quran by the Archangel Gabriel. So for those of you who've studied Jewish and Christian traditions, these stories of angels might be familiar, and a lot of them kind of appear in their own sort of way in Islamic traditions as well. And then why this message? From a Muslim perspective, to return humanity to the belief in a singular God, because the people of Arabia had begun to worship other gods than the single God from this perspective, and so they had become pagan. And also to return Arabia, or to, correct injustices in Arabian society that had become commonplace, such as, for example, slavery, female infanticide, tribal warfare and blood revenge. So it was seen in many ways as sort of a revolution, a social revolution, and a political revolution. So the Prophet Muhammad was born in 570, so in the 6th century, and he passed away in 632. In the 7th century, he was part of a prominent clan, part of a clan from a prominent tribal confederation in Mecca called the Quraysh. And he had a lot of trauma in his early life. So his father passed away before he was born, and his mother died when he was just 6 years old. And then he was taken in first by his grandfather, and then when his grandfather passed away, he was taken in by his uncle. And so this was really important in Arabian society at that time, in Meccan society, because there was a lot of warfare and there was a lot of insecurity, both because of scarcity of resources. So this is a desert region, but also, a lot of infighting between different groups. And so having the protection of the family was essential. So those who didn't belong to a particular tribal confederation were the most vulnerable, members of society. So for example, enslaved persons, orphan children, widows, among others. Okay. And so I'll just say one important point here. So this is like sort of a common story for those of you who've studied religious traditions of prophets. Many prophets begin their life with a lot of hardship and experience a lot of hardship throughout their lives. And this was certainly true for the Prophet Muhammad. And some say this is how he was able to identify with those on the margins of society. And also his message had a lot of appeal for people across a broad range of Meccan society at the time. And it continues to appeal to people around the world. Okay. So the night when the Quran was first revealed is seen in 610 CE, and it was in the hills outside of Mecca. And so here's an image of the angel Gabriel approaching the Prophet Muhammad. And it was on the night of destinies. This is what that night is called. It's the first time the Prophet heard the Quran recited to him. And so the angel approached him and commanded him to recite 3 times. And each time he said, "What should I recite?" He was terrified by this encounter. And then the angel, continued to coax him, "Recite in the name of your Lord." So he ran down the hill. He was incredibly frightened by this experience, and he sought comfort in the arms of his wife, Khadija, who many say is the first person to become Muslim because she's the first one to believe in his message and to encourage him in his prophecy. So this is said to have occurred on the night of destiny again, which happens in the last 10 days. It's said to occur in the last 10 days of Ramadan. So that would be this time period that we're in right now, actually. And so there are usually special prayers that happen during this time period. Okay. So again, these are 2 really important things, right? So the centrality of the Quran is the sacred text, and then, the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad, which are encapsulated in a body of texts or sources called Sunnah. And I can't actually read this whole thing myself, but I just wanted to share with you this hadith or this report that's attributed to one of the Prophet's other wives, Aisha. And she was asked to describe the character of her deceased husband after the Prophet passed away to a man who hadn't known him, because everybody was really curious about his life. They wanted reports about the Prophet, in particular those who hadn't met him after he passed away. And so, no stranger to the arts of rhetoric, she answered the man's question with a question. "Have you recited the Quran?" And the man affirmed that he had. And then she said, "Then you know his character. His character was the Quran." So this is a quote I took from Rudolf Ware's book, which is called The Walking Quran. And it's a study, an ethnographic study of the history and practice, even contemporary practice of learning and memorizing the Quran in African Muslim communities. I'm just going to skip through this. We can come back to these 5 pillars in a bit. Okay, so I'm going to come back to the significance of that story in a minute. So in terms of like the presence of Islam in Africa, when did this begin? So as I was saying, the first message happened in Mecca, and the Prophet Muhammad began preaching to the community in Mecca. He received a lot of opposition when he started reciting the Quran, because it challenged this idea that you could worship multiple gods, which was the common practice of the people of Arabia at that time. And so his message that there was only one God was sort of seen as an affront to some of the leadership there. So the early community faced a lot of persecution, boycotts, and other struggles, especially those, again, who didn't have the protection of the family. So the most marginalized among the early community decided to flee, and they fled in 615 CE, according to the traditions, crossing the Red Sea from the Arabian Peninsula to Africa, the region that's now known as Eritrea and Ethiopia. So it's called Abyssinia. And this was the site of one of the most ancient Christian communities of societies of the world. And so the Christian king of Aksum in Ethiopia is said to have offered asylum to the Muslims, and they sought refuge there. So that was sort of the first emigration out of the Arabian Peninsula, and it was to Africa. And so this is seen as like the earliest formation of sort of Muslim communities on the continent. And then there was a second, more famous emigration that occurred in 622. And that's when the Prophet and the rest of his companions who had remained in Mecca fled to Medina, the city of Medina, seeking refuge there. And this event is important because it marks the first year of the Islamic lunar calendar. And so here is a representation of that encounter in Abyssinia, where the Christian king welcomed the Muslim refugees. So when the community arrived in Medina in 622, they started building, institutions. The earliest mosque was in Medina, but they also had to find ways of, consolidating not only their political power, but also, the Muslim community as a whole. So it was a very pluralistic state. Jewish and Christian and pagan communities were accommodated according to the traditions in sort of the law of the state and the constitution of Medina, but sort of the Muslim community had pride of place. And early on, the Prophet realized, we need a way to call the people to prayer. So Jews have a horn that calls people to prayer. Christians have the bells. So how are Muslims going to let people know when to pray, when they have to pray 5 times a day? So one day he heard a story of a formerly enslaved person named Bilal, who had a really beautiful voice. Bilal was is said to have been the son of an Ethiopian mother or an Abyssinian mother and an Arab father, and he was born into slavery. And then with the Muslim movement, he was freed from slavery. And so the Prophet Muhammad approached Bilal and asked him to perform the call to prayer. So here you can see sort of a pretty classic image of Bilal. So this is actually in Mecca, not in Medina, on the Kaaba, which is the sacred house and the focal point of Muslim prayer. So 5 times a day, Muslims pray towards Mecca and specifically towards this black cubicle structure that's called the Kaaba, the house of God. So Bilal performed the prayer, which is called the call to prayer, which is called the adhan, and 5 times a day, and even on Friday before the congregational prayers, this happens. And so I bring up this story simply first to sort of show this connection again of exchange between African Muslim communities and Arabian communities at this early period of Islam. And it wasn't always pleasant exchange. Slavery was a thing. But also to show the importance of African role models in the earliest periods of Islam. And so figures like Bilal continue to be models of inspiration for African Muslims in the diaspora. And so many African American youth take the name Bilal, for example, and also for a lot of Africans on the African continent. So this is one of the earliest companions of the Prophet. Okay. So here's just a map of those 2 hijras that I was talking about. So again, the first one across the Red Sea to Ethiopia, and then the second one to Medina. So there is a very large population of Muslims on the African continent and not just in Northern Africa. So the majority of Muslims in the world live in Southeast Asia, in particular in Indonesia, which might come as a surprise to some. And then, the African continent has one of the largest populations as well. And so, this idea that Islam is sort of a Middle Eastern phenomenon is not entirely accurate. It's a, global religious tradition. So again, this is the area that I'm going to be giving a lot of examples from, the Sahel, which includes countries like Mauritania, Mali, Senegal, and Sudan. So in the early period of Islam, so after sort of the Muslim, community gained momentum and the message of the Prophet Muhammad was becoming widespread, this message began to spread beyond the Arabian Peninsula. And so after the Prophet died, his successors, who were called the caliphs, began to expand the Muslim empire into Persia, into Byzantium, or the territories that were Byzantium, and then across the African continent. And there were extensive trade networks already, between these areas, and you can see them represented here on this map. But Islam sort of intensified these networks. And so trade became much easier through these Islamic connections. And so people use these historic trade networks to sort of set up shop. Muslims from the Middle East, from North Africa would go down south, and, kind of exchange knowledge, but also resources. But then over time, Islam sort of facilitated the exchange, these contracts, between people, these economic exchanges, because it provided a network of trust. It provided rules about interest, for example, and how you handle sort of various different types of economic relations. And so, the Sahara in particular was a really busy sort of area for this exchange. What's also important about this region is that it was, especially the Sahel and the Western Sahel, incredibly wealthy. So there was a lot of gold, especially in, the rulers of the 14th century, like Mansa Musa, for example, who I'll talk about, were incredibly wealthy African kings. There was a lot of salt in the region. And so this was some of, the biggest pockets of wealth in the world at that time. And they were well known in other parts of the world, in the Middle East and Europe and elsewhere as well, for, not only their wealth, but also for the scholarship that they produced and for, the architecture that they were producing. So I'm going to kind of discuss these using this framework. I know that was a lot of background information. So the importance of the word for sort of these material cultures that we'll talk about in this region: spaces of worship, friends of God, so holy persons, for example, and travel and pilgrimage. So I'll start with this hadith, or this saying that's attributed to the Prophet Muhammad. No one leaves their house in search of knowledge, but that angels will lower their wings in approval of what he is doing. The best of you are those who learn the Quran and teach it. Okay, so, and then from the Quran itself, there's the command, recite in the name of your Lord, who created humans from a clinging form. Recite, and your Lord is most generous, who taught by the pen, taught man what he knew not. So this idea of knowledge and learning and, embodying the Quran and knowledge of the Quran is very much inscribed, in the primary sources. Does anyone know what these are, these objects that I'm showing you right now? So we can be a little bit interactive here. You can just raise your hand. Are they familiar? I can't see any hands. Dr. Cobb, can you see any hands?
I cannot, and I'm going to be honest that I'm not even sure that I know what they are. So I'm looking for it. Oh, there's one. A writing plate, someone said.
Yes, yeah, writing plate. That's like a very good description. So more specifically, a writing board, a wooden board. So they're called, Quranic boards sometimes by some translations, and the term that's used in Arabic is called lawh. And this comes from this idea of the preserved tablet. So a lawh is a tablet, and the idea that the Quran has always existed. It's not something that was created by humans. It has always existed in time. it's eternal, just like, God, because it's the word of God. So if it was created, then it was created by God. And so this idea of sort of a primordial tablet, this archetype, the Quran is sort of the archetype of this. And so these boards are representations of this tablet, this divine tablet. And they're used by students in Quran schools to practice learning how to recite the Quran, but also write Arabic. So this one here to the left is from Mali in Western Africa. And this one here, I believe, is from, so it's also from Mali, from the Gao region. And so depending on where you are regionally in the African continent, and this is very much a tradition, distinctive of the Sahel cultures and the West African cultures, the shape of the lauf might differ. And so you can see the handles here, don't look quite the same. So the artisans, from a particular area have a different way of sort of expressing this idea of this tablet. And so, yeah, the students are given, these sort of pens, like, historically, from what I understand, the ink was made of some kind of charcoal, and then they sit, together, usually with their teacher, in rows or in a circle, usually on the floor, and they're writing and reciting, sort of in unison, but not really in unison, because when you listen, everybody's sort of reciting at a different level. So it can actually sound a little bit chaotic sometimes, and one wonders, how does the teacher hear whether someone has the correct recitation when so many people are reciting at the same time? And so what often ends up happening is that there's a lot of peer-to-peer learning. Students teach each other or help others. So someone who's mastered a particular recitation or particular verse will then help, other students with that. And it, kind of distributes the knowledge and takes the burden off the teacher in that way. But this is sort of the traditional way of doing that. Does anyone have any reason why these boards would be used beyond the fact that they're sort of representation fine tablet, which is that we're on? Why use these wooden boards in learning? So paper is expensive, or at least it was really expensive, and it wasn't really readily available. Let's say, for example, in the 14th or 15th century, they weren't going to waste whatever paper they had on, young children practicing, to write Arabic and memorize the Quran and making a lot of mistakes along the way. So it had to be something that was easily recyclable, like a board that can be washed. And so at the end of every lesson, at the end of every day, once the student has sort of mastered a particular section of the Quran, then, they wash the board, and rather, because it's the word of God, in a lot of communities, at least historically, I don't know that it's as widespread today, they would then drink, the ink in the water in order not to sort of waste the word of God. And so that was not only the practice of reciting constantly and memorizing the Quran, but then also, ingesting this ink is seen as sort of a way of embodying the sacred. Okay. So let's see here. I just have to move this picture so I can see. So these Quran schools historically were often, part of a mosque, like a section of a mosque and held in a mosque, or even more commonly held in the home of the teacher. Nowadays with sort of modernization and sort of, the more modern school structure, you have separate institutions or separate schools, for this purpose, but it continues to operate in the same sort of way. I mean, the teacher might open up a school in their home. Certain scholars of Islam, and in particular Islam in Africa, such as Louis Brenner and Butch Ware, have noted how Western observers, like colonial observers, for example, that were, doing research or working in West Africa in the 19th century, in their commentaries, they kind of viewed this practice of memorization of the Quran and the teaching of the Quran schools as backward and irrational. And some of the things that they said was, it's just routine memorization. They're not learning to think, they're not learning to interact with the text. But then those who adhere to this tradition and more recent scholarship has said this is not just passive learning. The idea was to get the students again to embody the word of God and to sort of create a foundation for the knowledge that they would later build. That they would build later on. And many of them did go on then to study poetry or math or, law in many cases. They became major historians. But all of this, having understood the tradition and, the basis of the tradition very well, because it was inscribed on their bodies or in their bodies in a sense. And so in that sense, the idea is that they become agents of change in the world because they have this constant guide with them. And so children as young as 10 years old can memorize the entire Quran, which is 114 chapters. So you can imagine how long that takes. And once somebody has memorized the Quran, they have a special title, which is called a hafiz. And a hafiz is someone, it's just the term for someone who's preserved the Quran, has preserved sort of sacred tablet. The work is painstaking, it's meticulous, it's tiring. And again, it's a way of shaping, sort of ethical human beings, disciplined human beings that can sort of, carry the character of the Quran in the same way that the Prophet Muhammad was seen as, a reflection of the Quran, in their day-to-day lives. And so this idea again that his wife Aisha said his character was the Quran, that's sort of what the teachers are trying to achieve in these schools, is to cultivate walking Qurans, as Butch Ware has called them. Okay. But again, it's not just routine memorization that these kids are doing throughout their lives. So once they've built this foundation, they've learned, to write in their local, to write in Arabic, to write in what's called ajami. Ajami is when you write in a local language, not Arabic, using Arabic script. And once they have memorized the Quran, they know it inside and out. They've memorized a lot of the sayings and reports from the Prophet. Then they start to study other things. And they use this knowledge not only for navigation, for example, or, for medicine, and but also, for protective purposes. And so a lot of the texts that were produced in this region in the 14th century, 15th century, for instance, a lot of them are very esoteric. They're very secretive. They contain this secret knowledge. And so they have magic squares, that have a lot of numbers that are kind of difficult to decipher. They have calligraphy that in the shape of people or in the shape of animals. And all these are supposed to sort of signify, have a certain power, mystical quality to them. So people often would approach the scholars if they had a problem, say their marriage wasn't working out or there was a child sick at home. And, the scholars who sort of, again, become experts in these traditions can create formulas for them, and sometimes they'll put those formulas in an amulet and people would wear those amulets. And often it includes verses of the Quran or other, traditions. So these examples are from Mali as well, in Western Africa. Or this one on the left is from Mali, and the one on the right is from Guinea. Modern day artists, this example is from Senegal, and the Murid Sufi community in Senegal continue these practices. So they use calligraphy, they use symbols of Islam, and they use sort of their knowledge of, the esoteric arts. The divination, of the occult, and of healing, to kind of create these types of texts for their communities. And so this artist, who's from Senegal, used, so basically this is a poem that's inscribed that he's written here on this piece of cloth. So it's very colorful. You can see the text in the middle with that green sort of swirl. There's the yellow text there. And it's a poem that's supposed to protect the world. So he says it incorporates mystical calculations, and I quote, I have put the verses in this painting, but I also work with numbers, and there is numerology embedded in the text. If one wants to be protected from the evil eye and the evil tongue that spits venom, one must read this. And if you want to avoid the evil eye, that comes from the hand of man. So, or then you must absolutely read this. Therefore, I have put many hands of men, women, and children in all different colors, and this stands for humanity. So this is sort of a modern interpretation of these traditions. And then this figure here in the top left corner is a Sufi saint from Senegal, who I'll talk more about later, but he appears a lot as sort of a protective figure, and a source of blessings and intercession for Sufis in Senegal today. So communities in Western Africa, in particular in the Sahel, around the Senegal River, around the Niger River, had immense libraries. So they traveled widely, they interacted with scholars around the world, in particular through pilgrimage. I'll talk more about that later, but they had their own traditions of scholarship, again, written, in Arabic, but also local languages using the Arabic script. And so these libraries developed over centuries and were preserved by the families and passed down from generation to generation. And so fortunately, we still have many of these manuscripts. And so a lot of the families have sort of opened them up to the public. But unfortunately, in recent years, like let's say the last 10 to 15 years, the rise of sort of a more radical Islamist group has created a challenge for like Al-Qaeda, for example, created a challenge for some of these families because they attacked some of these libraries and also some of the shrines of the scholars that continue to be very much revered. So there's a preservation issue that continues, but the community is very much invested in doing that. And a lot of international organizations have come together to try to preserve these heritages and texts. So here is one example. So if any of you decide that, you want to learn Arabic and become a historian of Islam in Africa, you might very well find yourself sitting next to the founder of this library, and working through some of these texts on magic or on medicine or whatever the topic might be. Okay, so we just talked about the word and the importance of the word. So the Quran, poetry too, but also protective verses and the material culture that kind of developed around the word. So the next section then is on space and worship. Where do people enact this word, so to speak? Where do they, continue to reaffirm their faith? So perhaps the most obvious example of that would be, a house of worship like a mosque, a church, or a synagogue, right? But there are other spaces as well. The place of prayer, according to one hadith, in religion is like the place of the head in the body. So it kind of gives you a sense of sort of the centrality of prayer as a constant guide. That's, why the 5 daily prayers are so important. It's a constant awareness of God and reminder, that's not only through the prayers that are uttered, but also through the bodily practices that go into, performing the prostrations. Excuse me. Okay. So like I said, probably the most obvious example of a space of prayer is a mosque. But really, a place of prostration, which is called a masjid, can happen anywhere. You can pray pretty much anywhere. You just have to, from a Muslim perspective, be able to identify the Qibla, which is the direction of prayer towards Mecca. So nowadays, there are apps on your phone that you can download. So if you don't know where you are, you're in class or something, and you want to, pray, at a break, you can look on your phone, identify the Qibla, and then pray in that direction after performing ritual ablutions or cleansing yourself. And so people maybe will do that, in a restroom if there's no specific area designated to do that today. But in a mosque, you have all those things. So what I'm showing you here is an idealized representation of a house of worship for Muslims, again, called a mosque. And so, and this would be a Friday mosque. So there are the 5 daily prayers that Muslims, perform every day, ideally. And then on Friday, there's a special prayer that all sort of men of age are considered obligated to attend, that includes a sermon. So the other prayers don't have a sermon, but this one does. So the leader of the community will come up and give a sermon on a particular issue. So in a mosque like this, it's much larger. There's spaces for men and women. There's a tower called a minaret, and that's the tower from which the person who gives the call to prayer, historically would have stood. Nowadays, they don't really climb up there as much anymore. So there are loudspeakers, and so it'll be broadcast from inside the mosque. And then, there are these other features as well. So I've given sort of a similar example here. This is the Al-Azhar Mosque in Cairo, Egypt. And yes, Egypt is in Africa, so, it connects, right? But it's quite different from the mosque that we're going to see going forward. Okay, and here just sort of some common sort of decorative features that you might see on mosques in Iran or in Turkey, Damascus, etc. So does anyone recognize this image, this building, this structure? Does anyone know what it is? So this is the Great Mosque, or the Friday Mosque of Djenné in Mali, again, in Western Africa. It's probably one of the most iconic examples of African architecture, and in large part because, it's been reconstructed over and over, a few times throughout the centuries. And the last time I think that it was rebuilt was in 1904, something like that. But what's unique about it, in comparison to the mosques we see a lot of the time, it's not really unique for the environment in which it exists, but is that it's made completely from the local environment. And so it's made from mud brick. So the mosque is basically borders, or is in a town that borders the Niger River. And so when that river floods, there's this mud that's, when mixed with shea butter, becomes very hard. And so the community used that to build this structure. And on the inside, it's very basic. Like the main design is sort of, the scaffolding that you see on the outside, and this crenellation on the top there, these missile-like towers. And so in that sense, it's similar to maybe the other structure in that you have these towers, but it doesn't look quite as much like some of these Middle Eastern mosques that we might generally encounter. And it's not as highly decorated on the outside or the inside, according to this interpretation. Decoration, again, comes from the local environment. So you don't see calligraphy, you don't see tile work, you don't see arabesques, and yet it has its own majesty and its own beauty. And so, yeah, this is a great mosque, and a lot of the houses in the area are built in the same kind of way as are a lot of the smaller mosques. So here, I'll give you, on the inside, there are 90 columns that hold it up. And again, it's built completely from these local materials and sort of very cool on the inside. The only light that comes in comes from these light wells that are on top of the mosque. And so they create their own sort of design effects, the play of light on the inside at different times of day. There is a mihrab, or an arch, that points the believers to the direction of.
Just to, and not to interrupt you, but there was a question in the chat asking if there was an issue a couple of years ago with the stability of that mosque.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I don't know if it was this specific mosque. It might have, and that's been an issue. That's why it's sort of been rebuilt over time, is because, these are, materials that kind of need to be patched up constantly. And I'll talk about that more soon. So I'm not sure of the specific controversy or incident that you were referring to, but erosion is a big concern, and especially because the river floods a lot. And so flooding and drought are big problems, in this part of Mali. But every year there is a festival where the community comes together and they patch up the mosque. So it's a replastering festival, and so they bring in the mud from sort of the the Niger Plains in these buckets, and then they use the scaffolding to replenish it and to plaster it and fix it. So it's constantly being, again, yeah, replenished, and constantly, the community is constantly involved in its preservation. And men and women participate. So most of those you see on the scaffolding are men, but women, in particular unmarried women, participate by passing on the buckets of mud, to the builders. And there are particular families or classes within Malian society that are masons of this particular architecture. So they're trained in this particular way of building. And they're well known, the families, and they work very closely with the local community. For the sake of time, I was going to show you a video about this, but I can give you the link later, so I'm going to move on. And then here's some other examples of earthen architecture in the region. And so this is the tomb of a famous Malian king called Askia Muhammad, and it's one of the biggest architectural complexes in the region. So the tomb itself is not huge, but better complex encompasses it is. And there's been a lot of issue with these tombs being destroyed again by more extremist movements because it's seen as they see it as a problematic veneration of human figures. Okay, so the next section is about travel and pilgrimage, and the importance of travel and pilgrimage and connecting African communities to Muslim communities elsewhere in the world. And so there's this prophetic hadith that said, seek knowledge even in China. And so from the beginning, this has been, very important. Probably the biggest trip that people take and are obligated to take once in their lifetime, provided they have the financial means and they're able-bodied, is the Hajj. And so this is the pilgrimage to Mecca, in particular the sacred enclosure, which includes this house of God. And so here's a difference between pre-COVID and COVID times. It's changed quite drastically, the experience. So African Muslims, it's very challenging for a lot of people on the continent, Muslims on the continent, to make this journey because it's so far away and not everybody can afford to do it. But those who do, when they come back, are very celebrated, and they hold the title of Haji for the rest of their lives. So one of the most famous stories of, a West African king going on Hajj is that of Mansa Musa. Some of you might have heard of him, but he was a king in the 14th century. He was immensely wealthy. He controlled this gold empire. And he took a caravan of 60,000 people, according to the histories, across the Sahara, through Cairo to Mecca. And it was in, I think, a period of 1 or 2 years or something like this. And then when he was in Mecca, he spent a lot in Medina, a lot of time studying with the scholars there and bringing back that knowledge that he acquired in the Arabian Peninsula from people, not just from the Arabian Peninsula, but from all over the world, because the Hajj is an opportunity for people from all over the world to meet and discuss, and people stay sometimes long after the pilgrimage in order to develop those networks. So he did that, and then on his way back, it said that when he stopped in Cairo, he stayed in Cairo for some time, again, to meet people there. But he was so intrigued by the markets in Cairo, so he bought up a lot of trinkets, and he gave a lot of money and resources in charity. The market was so overwhelmed, the inflation was so high that it crashed because of his visit. And so this is a tale that's often told about his journey. And then, he returned home, and he brought with him architects, and scholars, from these other parts of, Muslim societies to share their knowledge locally. Okay. So the Hajj, again, is a very, it's something that many Muslims really hope to achieve once in their lifetime. And again, it's seen as an obligation. And when you come back, you have bragging rights, bragging in a good way. So in Egypt, the ancient Egyptian city of Luxor, people represent their Hajj journey and the Hajj journey of their families on their houses. And so they hire, expert painters to depict their journey. And so you can see what's written there is Al-Hajj, and then the name of the people who went on Hajj and got that title. So that's there. And then the date that they went on Hajj. And so, what's interesting, it's sort of like an archive of Hajj, because you can see the different ways people have traveled over time. So some of them have ships, some of them have camels, some of them have airplanes, and you can sort of see that modernization. And then, of course, the Kaaba is represented here. And so what people in the region say is that, this is sort of after the practice of documenting our history that the ancient Egyptians did. So for those of you who've studied ancient Egypt and the pharaohs, and you can see an example to the right, this is sort of a similar thing, documenting the achievements of the community, in particular the journey of Hajj. So you might have heard from somewhere that Islam prohibits the representation of humans, or like figural representation in art. There's nothing in the Quran that actually says this or prohibits this. This is sort of something that's been interpreted by scholars over time. And artists themselves have taken different approaches to this. So some will only write beautiful words, beautiful calligraphy, only use geometric shapes and floral designs. And that in and of itself is an incredible way of sort of unifying the faith artistically. Others say there's really nothing, against this in the Islamic traditions. And so figural representation has long been a part of Islamic history. And here's an example of a Persian miniature that shows, people doing all kinds of different things. And what we do though, however, in these miniatures is they don't show a lot of depth. So it's like very two-dimensional, and people aren't made to look very realistic. So that's sort of how some people have gotten around that. So I bring this up because the next part that I'm going to talk about, and I'll just do this really quick, I'll just give a couple of examples, are the saints and the representations of Sufi saints in African arts. And so I'll skip this. One saint in particular, Ahmadou Bamba, who is the founder of the Murid Sufi order in Senegal. He has been widely represented in popular arts and devotional arts across Dakar and other cities in Senegal. So houses have images with him on them. Paintings are widely sold and displayed indoors and outdoors. And they're all based off of this one photograph that survives of him when he was taken into custody by the French colonial administration, in what was Senegambia at the time, because he was resisting colonial rule. And so while he never took an active or violent approach to his resistance, he was seen as sort of a passive resistor and a threat to the regime. And so he was taken into custody by the French colonial government. And when he was, they took this mugshot of him, and it's the only surviving image. So, his followers have used this, and I'm going to just skip this bit, to sort of represent his trials and tribulations, but also the miracles that he performed, throughout his life. And so one of those miracles is this one to the left, where he was transported from, I believe, I think it was Gorée Island, which was a major slave depot. It's where a lot of enslaved people were shipped from the African continent to the Americas. And it's a major site of pilgrimage for African Americans in particular, as well as other people around the world. But he was shipped from there to from Gorée Island to, I believe, Gambia. And he wasn't allowed to pray while he was on the ship. They wouldn't let him perform the 5 daily prayers. And so according to the traditions, he performed a miracle where he hovered above, off the ship, and then prayed on the water. And he was guided by the angel Gabriel, and all the fish in the sea prayed with him. And then the image to the right shows another trial that he experienced, where he was put in a den with a lion, and he pacified the lion. So the saint gives people hope. These are icons that people use when they worship, very similar to sort of the use of sort of icons and, of Catholic saints, and sort of how they help to concentrate one's, faith and belief and practice. for Muslims, it's not that they're worshiping the saint per se, it's just that he's a constant reminder and role model for them as they practice their faith. And this one with the hubcaps is pretty fun because a lot of businesses will have his image on them. And it sort of suggests that if you buy from us, you will receive the blessings of the saint, you know. So some takeaways, just major things. The teaching of the Quran and the Sunnah, which are the customs of the Prophet, are evident in the everyday lives of African Muslims. And we see this through efforts to preserve, embody, and reproduce the word through daily worship, through spiritual role models, for example, the saint that I just mentioned, and through seeking knowledge far and wide through travel and pilgrimage. And again, Islam was not an outside force that was simply imposed on Africans, but it was received, adopted, and adapted to the lives and local environments of communities across the continent. So those are my main things. And I'm happy to take any questions if there's time.
Thank you so much. What a fascinating and thorough presentation. I learned so much. I'm really grateful for you. I want to open it up for people. If you'd like to unmute yourself and ask a question, feel free. Or if you're more comfortable typing in the chat, we'll give a few minutes just for you to take the time to write and ask Dr. Wortmann a question about this presentation. All right, here comes one. The first one is, how common is it for Islamic artists to represent people in their art? I've never seen Islamic art with people and always had heard it was forbidden.
Yeah, that's sort of the common narrative, both, within Muslim communities and beyond, that it's forbidden, but there's a very long history, in particular, like I was saying, in the Persian and Turkish traditions of painting, the miniatures of representing, even holy figures in art. So if we go back to the beginning of that presentation where I showed you that image where the Prophet Muhammad was receiving the Quran from Archangel Gabriel, he was actually depicted there, but he didn't have, his face was veiled. So often, like, there will be a veil put over his face and then flames in the background, which suggests that this is a holy figure, similar to sort of a golden aureola or a halo in Christian traditions. And sometimes he won't have hands. So it's kind of to get away from that anthropomorphic quality, to sort of represent but not represent. But in other traditions, for example, among the Murids of Senegal, it's very common not just to represent the saint whose features you can't see very clearly, because in the photograph, like, his eyes were squinted, and he had this turban wrapped around his face and his body was fully covered. But you'll see men and women, sort of holy figures, saints and teachers represented in their arts. So it really just depends on the community and in their interpretation.
Thank you so much. I'd love to see that picture you just, the image you described there. So another one comes about sort of the global perspective that you mentioned. How come the Muslim faith is associated with the Middle East? Oh, wait, I lost it. There it is. If most Muslims don't live in the Middle East.
I think it's a lot of that has to do with the early history and sort of the origins of the faith. I'm sorry, I'm just finding that image for you.
Thank you.
The origins of the faith and the community. And so, people often see it as like, especially because certain countries like Saudi Arabia have a lot of power and authority when it comes to dictating sort of what global Islam looks like, because they're the guardians of the Kaaba, right? And because they host the Hajj. And so this is a major meeting point. So I think that's one of the reasons, because it's the birthplace and it continues to be a really important point of convergence for Muslims around the world. But then over time, I think, major institutions of learning did develop, in Egypt, for example, through the Al Azhar Mosque, in Damascus, through the major mosques there. So I think that's part of it. It's, because of that proximity to the Arabian Peninsula, but also because of the Arabic language. And so even for Muslims who don't speak Arabic as a first language, Arabic is incredibly important still, and learning Arabic is important because it helps you to read the Quran in the original language that it was revealed. So I think that's why some of these associations continue to persist. But those of us working in other parts of the world are really going to push back on that and show, like, there are these rich traditions that existed in even as far as China, let's say, of course, if we go with that hadith, even though China's only far if you're in a particular part of the world, right? It can be very close as well. But yeah, so Muslims were everywhere from very early on.
There are two more. Do you think it would be correct to say that there was a positive correlation between Islam and African societies and their innovations? And then the second one, could you talk about Muslim women in public spaces? Are African Muslims less segregated than Muslims in Saudi Arabia and elsewhere?
Oh, those are really great questions. Let me start with the second one because it's freshest in my mind. I think that generally, so this narrative that Muslim women are excluded from the public sphere and that they live in seclusion, it's not to say that's not true in some places of the world, it is. And as we're seeing, like with the rise again of the Taliban in Afghanistan, it's kind of coming back in some areas where things had sort of changed. And so it kind of goes in ebbs and flows depending on who's in power and often according to sort of local patriarchal traditions, right? But I would say, like, it's interesting. I have a Saudi student in one of my classes, and she's like, everybody thinks that we wear hijab or we veil all the time, but I don't know anybody who wears hijab in Saudi Arabia, so she's like, we dress modestly, but like, things have changed. So people aren't, women are, in the public sphere, they're working, they're, going to restaurants, they're like meeting their friends, and they're, dressing in different ways than they were before. I think though, to the question with African societies, I would say that in many cases, yes, like especially like, for example, in Senegal, you do see women and in Tanzania, women in the public sphere much more maybe than you will in some parts, but no. What was the first question again?
Yes, I'm sorry, I rushed through them. Do you think it would be correct to say there was a positive correlation between Islam and African societies and their innovations?
Oh, absolutely. And I think that it really was just a two-way street, knowledge sort of building off of, knowledge systems building off of each other, because a lot of like the architecture that I was showing you, and even the textual traditions and the traditions of healing and the science, a lot of that, yes, there were Islamic influences, but a lot of it came from local knowledge as well. And so they complemented each other. Because there were a lot of long traditions of learning and knowledge transmission even before Islam in these African societies that I spoke about. So indigenous knowledge is very much writ large, I think, in a lot of the architecture and arts that we see across the continent.
Thank you so much. I don't see any questions coming in through the chat, so we'll take that as our cue to finish up. And if anyone else has a question that they want to ask, feel free to drop it into the chat. But thank you so much. We're so grateful for all the knowledge that you shared with us from your research and from your teaching. And we're just so appreciative that you joined us tonight. Michelle, I will pass it along to you for the Lyceum.